good evening, and welcome back to the Dusty Feet. It's May 26th, 2026, and we're continuing our Outside the Class discussion series. Right? It's a journey through the TaNaK, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Because the idea around Outside the Class is simple. First, watch the short in-class overview videos. Because in this series, we're going to move through the books of the TaNaK in their original order. We're going to be asking questions, slowing things down, noticing details we might normally pass over in. And we're trying to understand not only what these texts said back then, but maybe why they still echo now. We're keeping these episodes shorter, easier to follow, so whether you're catching up or walking with us week by week, you can stay connected along the journey. Right? Scroll by scroll, book by book, walking through this ancient collection together with curiosity, honest conversation, and as always, dusty feet along the way. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you are not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. TheDustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. It's designed around the written and spoken text. It's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook at the Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. 4. And as always, you're welcome to send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And of course, before we jump in, quick reminder, if you find these discussions useful, please click subscribe. But if you think someone else might enjoy exploring these scriptures this way, same as you, hit the like button because that really does help more people discover this series. Also, remember, the videos we discuss here, they're only the beginning, right? They are part of a much larger learning series, all from the Bible Project. Of course, I highly recommend you spending time in their app and on their website. Because along this road, we're going to ask a lot of questions. Questions about the text, about history, about people, choices, patterns, meaning. Answers? Well, we'll see where the path leads. Kings, our first scroll. This is our part 6. So last time we explored Solomon's early reign, famous story of his wisdom, right? But it's the moment where Solomon asked not for power or for riches, but he asked for understanding. So now as we drift into chapter 4, we begin to see what that wisdom might actually look like when it moved from prayer into practice. So honestly, this chapter can seem maybe a little strange at first because the opening verses are mostly a list of names, right? Officials, governors, administrators, regional leaders. It's the kind of material that many people, they skim over kind of quickly. But in the ancient world, lists like these, they mattered deeply. Because these lists, they were showing order, stability, structure. Because remember, Israel has recently come through its years of tribal fragmentation, civil conflict, we'll call it political uncertainty, right? Saul's reign, unstable. David's reign, right? He united the kingdom, but it also carried with it rebellion, war, internal family collapse. But now Solomon, he's inherited the throne, and the writer of this scroll, he wants us to notice something important. The kingdom is becoming organized. It's not merely powerful. Now it's structured, right? The first 19 verses, right? They describe priests, military leaders, record keepers, advisors, governors, regional overseers. Okay, it's of note, these are not broken down by tribal connections. We might see later if that ends up mattering. But in other words, all of these positions, they are a functioning government. And whether we realize this or not, this is probably one of the greater turning points in Israel's story. Because Israel is shifting from survival mode into, well, an administrative civilization, right? The text introduces these figures attached to the priesthood at the top, right? Including descendants of Zadok, Abiathar, right? They mention the military leadership connected to Benaniah. It references royal counselors, officials overseeing labor, right? Provision. And then it lists 12 regional governors, right? They're not listed as tribal leaders, and they each supplied provisions for the king's household during 1 month of the year, each of them. This was taxation, but it was also distribution. There was a development of infrastructure. No, it's not glamorous, but it is foundational, right? So maybe because it's foundational in and of itself, it might be worth pausing a bit, because wisdom in Scripture is rarely portrayed as a mystical abstraction, right? Biblical wisdom often looks practical. It keeps things functioning. It creates order from chaos. It builds systems, things to do, ways to sustain life. So sometimes wisdom is not merely knowing these profound truths. I think sometimes wisdom is organizing a nation so that people can eat. And with that, now we get to the section we're focusing on today, right? The text now shifts in verse 20, right? Judah and Israel were numerous as the sand by the sea. That phrase should sound familiar, should ring a bell. I'm looking for a hanging red string somewhere, because it echoes the promise first given to Abraham many, many generations before. This is covenant language resurfacing. Yeah. People have multiplied, kingdoms expanded, and the nation, well, at this point, it appears stable. And then the text says something, I think it's beautiful. I think it's simple. They ate and drank and were happy. And I think sometimes we overlook verses like these because they just seem ordinary. But in the ancient Near East, in that context, peace and stability were extraordinary, right? They were extraordinary. Because most kingdoms, they lived under constant threat of war, famine, invasion, collapse. But to simply eat, drink, live safely, that was a blessing. And then the text goes on, right? It says, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. Okay, remember, people, this is imagery. It's not physically, right, that everyone had vineyards and groves of grapes and figs, right? Yet the image of this imagery, right, it appears repeatedly throughout Scripture. And with Scripture, it's oft tied to a symbol of peace, right? The vineyard takes years to establish. The fig tree, it requires stability. You don't plant orchards if you expect an invasion tomorrow or if you're going to get up and wander around some more. So this really is language of security, right? Rootedness. And so I think there's something very deeply human here. Because people don't merely long just for survival. They long for peace, right? To build something, to sit, to rest, to paint, to raise families, to breathe. But then the chapter takes an interesting turn. Because then the scroll begins describing Solomon's wealth, right? Wealth and the resources. Thousands of stalls for horses, chariots, vast daily provisions, enormous quantities of flour. livestock. So maybe at first glance, this sounds like national success. In many ways, I guess you could say it was, but we need to be careful. We need to notice something subtle here, I think. So, some of these details, I think they begin echoing warnings from back in Deuteronomy, right, about future kings. Specifically, in that, there was a warning that kings should not multiply, they shouldn't have excessive horses, wealth, great military power. And I think this becomes important later because in First Kings is doing something sophisticated here. Yet it seems simple, but it's sharing the story. The whole story. It's not redacted, it's the fuller story. So while it's speaking, it's showing both the glory and the danger of Solomon's reign at the same time, right? The boon and the bane, right? I think it's one of the remarkable things about the Bible because it doesn't flatten its characters. It doesn't make them perfect or imperfect. So that in these stories, even during these moments of greatness, right, the hints of future cracks appear underneath the surface. The kingdom is flourishing, but also accumulation is beginning. Power is growing. Luxury is growing. Expansion is growing. And yes, eventually those things will carry consequences. But for now, in this chapter, right, the emphasis appears to still remain on wisdom because we get to verse 29 and it says, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight. That's good. And then it goes on to give us something to ponder, right? It says, wisdom as measureless as the sand on the seashore. So again, more sand imagery, right? The people were numerous like the sand. And now wisdom itself seems to be described like sand, right? Abundance, overflow, immeasurable depth. Solomon's wisdom has now become internationally famous. Because the text then goes on to compare him to the wise men of the East and to the rulers of Egypt. Now, that does matter because Egypt and the East, at that time in history, right, they're already known for scholarship, for astronomy, for mathematics, the ancient learnings of those cultures. So it's not merely saying Solomon that he was smart. I think it's saying that his wisdom rivaled the greatest intellectual traditions of the ancient world. And then we hear that Solomon spoke, what was it, 3,000 proverbs, and he composed like 1,005 songs. Side note, left turn like I like. It seems that even with the lives and the stories surrounded in these scripture events, that we realize that we've probably forgotten, that we've lost to antiquity. There was more known back then to Solomon's day than we know now, today. 3,000 Proverbs. The scroll of Proverbs, there's 30 chapters. You could say 30 Proverbs, although they do break down inside, but nowhere close to 3,000. So just think about that for a moment. But what we have here, we have this wisdom. This is God's provision to Solomon. And we need to remember, interestingly, it wasn't confined just to government rulings, people. It's found in poetry. It's found in music. It's found in reflection. It's found in his teaching. So one could say that the wisdom spills into culture. Because with that comes one of my favorite little details, right? That's the text says that Solomon described trees, animals, birds, reptiles, fish. So Why mention that? Because maybe biblical wisdom cannot be separated from creation. To study the world was part of wisdom, to observe those patterns, to notice nature, to pay attention to the world around. Because then here we have almost an echo of Genesis here. We have humanity exploring, naming creation, being part of it. Wisdom involved curiosity. And maybe that is something that we desperately need to bring back into our culture again. Not merely information or data chasing, right? We're talking about true curiosity, right? The willingness to observe deeply instead of reacting instantly. Maybe the willingness to sit with mystery instead of pretending or even driving to certainty. And then with that, the chapter closes by saying people from all the nations came to hear Solomon's wisdom, right? The nations are gathering. So listen, because this might be considered to be reflecting another thread from earlier biblical promises that Israel was meant to become a light to the nations, not through domination, not through military force, but through wisdom. I think that idea is profound because I'm inclined to, and I lean towards wisdom attracts, right? Truth, it draws people. Justice, it'll draw people. Healthy order draws people. I think it held true then, and I still think that holds true today. But maybe under that, there's a harder question is how do we discern that wisdom, right? Because our culture, right, it often confuses wisdom with intelligence. They're not the same thing. I'll go on a limb here and say that, say, AI will never be wise. A person, AI, can be highly intelligent and yet profoundly foolish, right? Biblical wisdom is not merely the accumulation of even knowing the words, right? I can recite the text. I think it's more, and we mentioned this before, we mentioned it last episode especially, was God alignment, right? Living in harmony, aligned with God, with others, with creation. I believe that's reflected in all of those in Torah instructions, right? Wisdom is learning how life actually works. I think the Messiah, about this, he talked about this in his teachings, in his parables. He did that over and over and over again. So Solomon, at least in this stage of his life, he appears deeply connected to that pursuit. And yet, and this is important, because I think the story will eventually show us that merely possessing wisdom does not guarantee living wisely, right, forever. Because that may be one of the great tragedies ahead in this Solomon story, right? That a person who understood truth, who was so wise, and still he drifted from his own wisdom, right? So I think maybe that should be a caution. I think that should be caution for us. I think it should keep us humble because knowing better and living better, well, they're not always identical. And then under that, I think there's another layer that's worth noticing. It's this chapter repeatedly emphasizes abundance. Talks about food, population, peace, knowledge, influence. Everything feels expansive, and yet Scripture consistently asks us the question, can abundance be handled without losing dependence on God? That question, that runs through the entire Bible, right? It references a few of the interactions with our Messiah. Goes right along with this. I think it's because prosperity often creates a different set of spiritual dangers than does suffering. I mean, in hardship, people cry out for God, but yet in abundance, well, I think people sometimes forget Him. And perhaps maybe that's why the biblical writers include these subtle warning signs, even during these moments of triumph, the reality of the whole story, what can be going on. We saw that with King David, right? The seeds of future problems, I think they're often planted during seasons of success. Yeah. I think that does give caution to that thought. Be careful, you will reap what you sow. But still, even in this, we don't want to miss the beauty of this moment because there's this brief window in Israel's history where there is peace, right? There's order, there's wisdom, there's creativity, there's curiosity, there's growth. The kingdom feels almost like a glimpse of what humanity was intended to become, right? It's not perfect, but it's closer. So maybe that's why these chapters matter. They awaken a longing in us, right? A longing for wise leadership, for true justice, for restful peace, for communities where people can safely sit beneath their own vine and fig tree. We're going to long for a world where wisdom is valued more than outrage, right? Where leaders pursue understanding God rather than merely the power itself. Where curiosity and humility still exist together. So maybe that's where we'll leave today's conversation, right? Solomon's kingdom stands at its height, nations flourishing, wisdom spreads outward like ripples in a pond. But we need to remember beneath the beauty, there's quiet questions that remain. Can wisdom survive success? Can power remain humble? And can abundance remain faithful? And we know those questions, they're not ancient only, right? They're very much still ours today. So thank you for walking this Dusty Feet road with me tonight, right? As always, these conversations are meaningful to you. Consider subscribing, sharing them with others who enjoy exploring scriptures and thoughtfully, honestly, the way we do here. And remember, these discussions are not about arriving at easy answers. They're about learning to walk the path carefully with curiosity, humility, and maybe we can pick up a little more wisdom along the way. So to you all tonight, shalom, shalom.